It was early winter in the middle of a global shutdown. I was on uni break and I didn't have much work since, well, we were in the middle of a global shutdown. I needed something to fill the void to keep me from going absolutely stir crazy. On June 14th, 2020, Atlas announced the Steam release of Persona 4 Golden. Coming off the back of Persona 5, a couple of my friends and I were beside ourselves with excitement. We jumped on it immediately, and then my life melted away. I enjoyed Persona 5 quite a lot when I played it, but Persona 4 Golden captivated me in a way that no game had done since childhood. I've only played through it twice at this point, but that initial playthrough really stuck with me. There were days where playing P4 was all I could do, and all I could think about. In extremely scary and uncertain times, it gave me a safe place to utterly absorb myself into. At the peak of my escapism, playing P4 was the only thing I did in any given day. It was a wild time. 70-ish hours of playtime and 2 months of real time later, the credits rolled and I decided then and there that it was one of the best games I'd ever played. The Switch port released in January of 2023, and I was hesitant to replay it. Despite having the urge to several times since that initial run, I was always scared that a replay would feel completely different to my initial run, thus altering my overall perception of the game. What if the fond memories I had of P4 would slowly be dismantled and warped over the course of a replay? After a while, I said, screw it, and I decided to boot it up. This video isn't going to be a grand dissection of everything that makes up Persona 4 Golden. If you've been here before, then you'd know that my videos are more of a reflection on my experiences with the game being discussed. I may occasionally go into detail about aspects of the game, so I'll throw a tiny spoiler warning here since this is a more story-focused game, but chances are that if you're watching this, you've already played P4 at some point in the decade since its original release. I won't be focusing on everything the game has to offer, and I won't even really talk about major plot points because, well, that's not the point of this video. I'll instead be exploring the effects of replaying a game that I hold extremely close to my heart, and as the title suggests, it wasn't as easy as you'd think. To say that my first playthrough of Persona 4 Golden was magical would be an understatement. The early game was a bit rough, but that was absolutely due to how I played. I feel like the opening hours of P4 have a much smaller margin for error compared to P5. Eventually, I found my footing and figured out how to play it properly. I think P4 taught me how to more deliberately fuse personas. I sort of just made whatever in my first couple attempts at P5 and in the early stages of P4, but as I went through it, it started to make more sense. Nowadays when I play, I make more conscious decisions when fusing. There's a good amount of footage that I've scanned through in the replay, which consists of me senselessly mumbling to myself about the best case scenario to fuse a new persona from the ones I currently had. I love looking at what I think would be the best moves for it to inherit, and if the stats of the new persona are on the whole better than the ones being used in the fusion, as well as factoring in what arcana it belongs to. I get a goofy dopamine hit from making what I see as the perfect fusion. However, for me, Persona is at its best when I get to do the social sim stuff. The JRPG mechanics are fine, sure, whatever, but what truly keeps me engaged is the stuff surrounding the core JRPG gameplay loop. I love planning out my days, figuring out if I should hang out with Chie or Yosuke, go to work, or study in the library. I just love doing silly little tasks to make arbitrary stats and friendship meters go up. Effectively planning out my afternoons and evenings in Persona games scratches an itch in my brain that I can't quite describe. For a first playthrough, I try to avoid guides for min-maxing my social links, quests, Persona fusions, and so on. I can absolutely guarantee that I screwed myself out of social links and insanely powerful fusions because of this, but I enjoy trying to figure it out myself. I like to look at all the dialogue options and see if I can pick the answer that most appropriately fits the general vibe of the character that I'm interacting with. I get it right sometimes, but other times the clear joke answer is just too hard to pass up. I jumped on P4 the minute it launched on Steam. In typical first playthrough of a Persona entry fashion, I horribly mismanaged my time in the early to mid-game, then frantically tried to max out as much as possible in the tail end of the game to complete as many quests and social links as I could with the little time I had remaining. And yes, don't worry, I got that social link maxed out in time. I loved trying to piece together the murder mystery, and by some miracle, I actually figured out who the culprit was fairly early on. Looking back, it may have been very obvious, but since I now have that knowledge, it makes it kind of hard to tell on subsequent playthroughs if it was actually that obvious, or due to my already knowing the outcome, I just overanalyze all the dialogue in an attempt to make myself seem like some sort of ace detective. The early patches of P4's Steam release were interesting, to say the least. I remember Yosuke's scooter being the single loudest thing in the game for a time. I'm not talking slightly louder than the background music. It was genuinely about 7 times louder than anything else happening at the time. Much to my dismay, and my friends' relief, they patched it out eventually, but those early days with the loud scooter were something special. We would laugh our asses off any time it happened. On the flip side, I remember my first time fighting Mitsuo. P4 fans know that there's a seemingly insurmountable difficulty spike when you get to Mitsuo on your first playthrough. I lost more times than I can remember, but I refused to lose the war of attrition. I painstakingly whittled down his health for what felt like an hour, and eventually, his health bar emptied and I'd finally beaten him. Those initial couple patches on Steam weren't the most stable, and up to that point, I'd been very lucky, having encountered no crashes. I must have done something to push my luck that day, because I was mid-dialogue when it happened. I never had an opportunity to save. I was watching the post-boss fight cutscene and the game crashed. My jaw dropped. I launched the game back up, and the crushing weight of my reality sunk in. There was my save, right before the boss fight. I did the whole thing all over again. To say that that second time around was demoralizing would be an understatement. I was not okay. I also remember in the wee hours of the morning one night, my friend and I were sitting in Discord as he was going through the dungeon for that very same boss fight. He was partway through the boss when he had to call it for a night. He really didn't want to have to do the fight again, and I knew how painstakingly long it could be. So I did what any sane human being would do. I told him to boot up Steam's remote play function, go to bed and jump in Discord on his phone. I connected to his PC remotely, streamed his P4 game to the call, and played out the fight for him. He watched with bated breath as I slowly chipped away at the boss. Eventually, we got there. We beat the boss and got through the dialogue crash-free. I saved his game and we said goodnight at what I think was about 3:30 or 4 in the morning. Occasionally when we reminisce about P4, we look back on that memory and laugh about it. Despite only playing through this game twice, I've had the pleasure of fighting and beating that boss 4 times. It's small moments like these that really help to solidify my love for Persona 4 Golden. It may be a single-player game, but by virtue of playing it parallel to my friends, we got to experience the journey together. For a time, we were solving the mystery alongside each other. I'd blitzed ahead of my mates at some point, so it was good fun seeing their reactions to certain story beats or particular fights. Those memories really helped to elevate the overall experience. I'm sure that I'm not the only one to experience P4 in such a way, but having those memories helped to solidify it as one of my favorite games ever. I may not be as close to those friends as I was back in 2020, but I will forever look back fondly on our shared first playthroughs. The importance of escapism during the global shutdown is something that cannot be understated. With very little you could actually do, people would flock to hobbies, crafts, or anything in between. As you can clearly tell, my most prevalent form of escapism was video games. It wasn't just P4 that I'd run to. New Horizons and SnowRunner come to mind as well. However, the former clearly engrossed me like no other. I fell in love with Inaba and its inhabitants almost from the very beginning. Something about this small rural town just clicked in a way that P5's Tokyo never could. Don't get me wrong, the sheer scale that P5 has is crazy. I loved exploring all the locations and activities within it, but something about my perceived lack of grandeur in P4's locations really resonated. I became utterly enthralled in its quiet charm. The smaller scale made every location feel realized and even a bit cozier? Comparing the two feels weird considering their settings are polar opposites, but it's the only similar experience I've had that I can draw comparison from. As the game progressed, everything in the town became so familiar. To be a little exaggeratory, it felt like the more I played, the more I was becoming a member of Inaba's community. I'd frequent the smithy, the general store/pub, and the shrine. I'd eat with my friends at Aya or go fishing on the riverbank. I'd go on outings with my friends to take in the scenery or to help a kid find his lost teddy bear. I well and truly absorbed myself into this world. The overarching pop rock aesthetic heard in the soundtrack really helped solidify my enjoyment. I'd find myself singing along to the various bops that would play as you'd wander around town or hang out with friends. There were definitely some stinkers though. I still associate Kanji's dungeon with the filthy migraine it gave me upon hearing the music and navigating my way through the steamy haze for the first time. But on the whole, the music is great, and I love listening to my silly little songs. A lot of the students and younger adults in the game complain that Inaba is a nothing town with very little to do, but that's what helped to keep me engaged with it. This small town experience was something that I didn't really have growing up. Getting to the local shops took a decent enough walk that a teenage me couldn't justify it, and even if you did go to them, there wasn't anything spectacular there that'd be open after school. Just the supermarket, really. If you wanted to get to a proper shopping centre, it would be a bus ride or two. My high school days were well and truly behind me by the time I experienced P4, but I loved to vicariously live that life through the protagonist. Life seems generally slower in Inaba, and something about that was really comforting to me during the middle of a global shutdown. The outside world at the time of my playthrough was somehow slower. After all, I couldn't even leave my house for months at a time, but the little community of Inaba was like a warm blanket on a cold winter's night. Admittedly, they had their own problems going on. There was a serial killer on the loose for crying out loud. But Inaba felt so far removed from everything going on in my life that I couldn't help but escape into the life of the investigation team. I found it much easier to put myself into the fantasy created within Inaba and would often find myself taking pause just to be in it. I know that if I hadn't found comfort in Persona 4, there would have been something else to escape to. But I can't deny how serendipitous it was to be able to spend my days in Inaba, away from all the problems in my own world. March 2023 marked the time that I finally decided it was time to bite the bullet and replay P4 on my Switch. I'd kept putting it off for the longest time, finding some excuse not to return to Inaba. I installed it and prepared myself to go back into the TV world. I got through Yukiko's dungeon and bled a little into the investigation that would lead to Kanji's. All up, a solid 12-ish hours of game time. If I'm planning to make a video on a game, I record every instance of me playing it. I figure if I'm already going to be playing it, having access to the entire experience for videos will come in handy. According to the footage I've got, the next time I booted up the game was in mid-June. This year has been one of the more difficult ones that I've had the pleasure of navigating. A slew of personal events sprang up over a period of a couple months, which resulted in a sort of listlessness. This led to many afternoons of me feeling extremely lethargic and struggling to find motivation to get anything done. In an effort to try and feel productive, I finally booted up P4 again. I didn't end up clocking a ton of additional hours from that March save, but it felt surreal to be back in Inaba. Honestly, I'm sort of happy that I left my save where I had. It was just far enough in to get past the opening tutorial stuff, but not so far into the journey that I felt like I'd missed out on too much by leaving it in the backlog for as long as I had. Being able to just sit down and commit to something for any amount of time is something that I had scarcely been able to do during this period. But P4 had helped me find a sense of normalcy that I'd been sorely lacking. While it was extremely freeing to be back in Inaba after so long, and during a really tough period, there was this tiny part of me that felt unsettled by being back there during this replay. That feeling only seemed to grow as the hours racked up. I may have been revisiting these extremely familiar locations only 3 years on, but everything felt so different now. The blacksmith, pub, and shrine are still where they always were. My friends still wanted to go eat at Aya, and that same little kid was still missing his teddy bear. Inaba is unwavering. No matter what happens, I'll form the investigation team with the friends I make, and I'll live with Dojima and Nanako. I'll go on school trips, ride my scooter to the beach, and I'll go to the festival. There's nothing I can do to alter the story laid out before me. There's a small comfort in a known outcome, I suppose. From a pure video game perspective, the main story hits nowhere near as hard as it does on your first run. I wasn't itching to keep playing in order to find out what happens next, since, well, I already know the outcome. I can try to turn off my brain and just go along for the ride, but when the central focus of the story is who is throwing people in the TV world, it can be hard to care as much as I did when I know exactly what happens. I picked up on a couple extra details here and there, but I wasn't on the edge of my seat anymore. I didn't think the story was gaming's gift to fiction when I first played, but as I mentioned earlier, I enjoyed piecing together the mystery and figuring out who the culprit was. What can I say? I love a good murder mystery story. So if nothing's changed in Inaba, why did my experience a second time around feel so different? To put it simply, it's a matter of circumstance. I'm giving this whole guy talks about video games on the internet thing an honest shot, so there's now entirely different stakes with any game I play. I have half a dozen different scripts on the go at any given time, and I need footage for all those scripts. And I also need to think about what games are on the horizon that I should play, either to stream or for another video. And I also need games that I can play in my off time, so that this supposed interest of mine doesn't constantly have this incessant need to feel productive. Anytime I boot up something, be it for content or for relaxation, there's this little disruptive voice that tells me you should be doing this instead. No matter how you go about life, there's always going to be a list of priorities and something has to be at the bottom. But God, if it ain't difficult to shut that voice up so I can unwind by playing Halo 3 for the umpteenth time. I know that no matter what I choose to do with my time, that voice is still going to be there, so I try my best to shut it down. No matter how productive I am during a day, part of me decides that I could have been more productive. If that goofy little voice had its way, I'd be completely isolated from my friends because to it, sitting in Discord with them is time I could be spending recording more voiceover or finishing off that other script. I shut that voice out more often than not. After all, I recognize that it's not a healthy way to think, but it does make some moments quite difficult to actually exist in and be an active participant. Back in 2020, I could very easily commit to a lengthy campaign, but now that I'm not necessarily playing video games just for my own enjoyment, that same commitment has a looming dread hanging over it. Sitting down to play through Persona 4 Golden again would occasionally flare up these nasty little spirals, so I'd turn the game off. I still liked being in the world, but I couldn't do it for as long as I used to. While I was running through dungeons or riding my scooter around town, in the back of my mind, I knew that there were stakes attached to this playthrough, and that really started to get to me. What if all the time I put into playing, writing, and editing this strange little reflection on a game I love was for nothing? The time I spent doing all of it would feel wasted. If I average out my recording sessions, I'd get around 75 minutes, which I know is a luxury that some people don't have, but it's a far cry from the time I used to spend in Inaba, in a world I loved escaping to. This place that brought me a sense of peace and comfort was now bringing me a sense of uneasiness and dread. If this replay was attempted before this year, with no ulterior motives behind it, I think I would have had no trouble finishing it. But with my mind going where it does when I play, I don't really plan on finishing it. I'm only about 2/3 of the way through, and with everything that's been happening to worsen my already fragile mental state, I just can't see myself sitting with those feelings every time I boot it up. Even once this video is out and there's no innate pressure behind finishing the game, I still don't think I'll be able to sit with it. So where do I stand with one of my favorite games? For right now, I still hold Persona 4 very near and dear to my heart. I'll never forget the impact it had on me when I first played it and the memories that formed with it. The circumstances surrounding that initial playthrough may have left me with a hefty prescription on my rose-tinted glasses, but I don't blame the game for that. There's immense power in escaping into a fictional world in times of strife, be it a book, film, or video game, and Inaba was the world that I would run to. I thought it would be a world I could always run to, but it's clear to me now that escaping to familiar worlds will only work for me if I do it purely for my own enjoyment. My feelings towards media that I love will always shift in subtle ways. Sometimes you grow out of love for something you once considered perfect, and other times you learn to love something you were critical of years ago. Sometimes the smallest factors, like having a poor night's sleep or the weather being really nice that day, can see tiny shifts in your perception and consumption of a piece of media. We're only humans, and humans are swayed by seemingly trivial things. Even though my time revisiting Inaba wasn't quite the spectacular reunion that I expected it to be, I don't regret starting this replay. I may have felt uneasy and sometimes straight up miserable when I would play, but having the capacity to sit with my feelings about the replay, unpack them through writing about it, and really trying to get to the bottom of why I felt this way about something I supposedly loved so deeply was in a sense, relieving. This video has helped me understand why everything felt off, even if the process of making it into a video was the cause for these mixed feelings. Deep down, I know I still love this game, but my relationship with it at this moment in time just doesn't allow me to sit and enjoy it the way I once did, which is okay. I may not be in a place to revisit it comfortably right now, but I know that one day down the track, I will go back and finish that second playthrough. I've got quite a journey ahead of me, both in Inaba and outside of it. I still don't exactly know what the future holds for me, but I'm doing my best to not let the quarter-life crisis dread take over. No matter what happens, I know that Inaba will always be there waiting for me, should I need it.